All right, good morning. My name is Avi Ackerman. This is an interview with Sam Himes for the Gainesville Business History Oral History Project run by the Inquire Capitalism program of the History Department at the University of Florida. Understand that for us and for the public, the information you are providing is a gift, as it is an incredible historical resource, and we dearly appreciate it. This interview will be available as part of UF Oral History collections and through UF Digital collections and also YouTube. Could you please introduce yourself? What is your full name, and could you please spell it?
Okay. My name is Samuel, Samuel H. Himes, Him as in Michael, ES, Jr.
Thank you. So we'll get right into it. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself? Where did you grow up? What has been your relationship with Gainesville?
Okay. Well, I'm actually a fifth generation Floridian, and I was born and raised in West Palm Beach, grew up there, and stayed there through high school, and then went to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and that was my undergraduate education, but that was in political science. And upon graduation, a friend of mine from Chapel Hill was starting a business in North Carolina, and I went to work for him as his first employee and discovered that I really liked business. But I had no business education at that time. So I went back to Chapel Hill for a year as a special student to take all of the basic business courses and also to find out which aspect of business I most liked. And one thing I ruled out quickly was accounting, even though my father, my grandfather, my uncle were all CPAs, and we had a family firm in Palm Beach County, but that wasn't for me. So I decided to go on to graduate school. And my father had gone to UF, and he was somewhat disappointed when I didn't go to UF as an undergraduate. So I thought, well, okay, I'll make him happy, and I'll go to UF for graduate school. So that was when I first came to Gainesville. Was in 1966 to go to graduate school, and I started in business, in marketing specifically, and I was there for about a year, and I got FSU was starting a doctoral program at that time, and they made me an offer to come up there and join their program. And it was a pretty attractive offer, and it afforded me more opportunity than I thought I would probably get at UF. So I moved to Tallahassee, and that's where I got my doctorate. And then, but my business experience working for my friend, um, I was traveling a lot. I was doing a lot of different things. Um, and I decided probably my best use of that would be to teach. And so once I got my doctorate, I began teaching full time at the University of Alabama and was there for several years, taught some other places. And then in 1994, I moved back to Florida and settled in Ocala. And so that was my second exposure to Gainesville. So I had two uh, experiences in Gainesville, 30 years apart at that time. And of course, I've been in this area ever since. And even though I was living in Ocala, I did a lot of teaching in Gainesville at Santa Fe, UF, and elsewhere. So I got refamiliarized with Gainesville, which had changed dramatically in that time. Back in when my first time in Gainesville, 34th Street was pretty much the western edge of town. And it was a very different place. Of course, UF was a lot smaller. When I came back, all that had changed. And so for the past, well, until I retired in 2024, I spent 30 years in the Gainesville area. And so that's pretty much how my relationship with Gainesville got started. And obviously, in that process, I became acquainted with a lot of Gainesville businesses, one way or another. So that's a little background information.
Well, perfect. Thank you. And so when you first started taking those special classes at UNC, which topics did you find yourself most interested in? Was it the marketing courses, or was that more when you started at UF?
That marketing was my primary interest at that time, management secondarily. And so when I came to UF, I was in marketing. And when I went to FSU, marketing was my major, management was my minor. And so for many years, I taught nothing but marketing. And it's only in the last 20, 25 years that I gradually morphed into management. And at UF, I taught management rather than marketing. So those two areas were my principal focus.
And when did you start to decide that you wanted to teach instead of going specifically into working in business? When was that transition?
Well, I guess it came, during graduate school. Of course, there were educators in my family, so I had some exposure to that. But it was probably, in graduate school that I made that decision. Even though, I could have continued in business. And actually, I spent a couple of years as an academic administrator,
Mhm.
which is a hybrid. Even though it's in a university setting, a lot of the things that you do as an administrator are the same kinds of things you would do in business. Things like budgets and hiring and firing and all of that sort of thing. So I had that experience as well. But teaching, I think, was always of interest to me. I enjoyed the students, and so it just seemed to be a good fit.
And then what were some of the things that you noticed about being in, I think, four of these, southern college towns, UNC, Gainesville, Tallahassee, and also Tuscaloosa at University of Alabama.
Right.
What did you kind of notice during your times there, kind of the similarities and differences between these sort of southern college towns?
Well, of course, all of those that you mentioned are college towns. They're not in large cities. At that time, Gainesville and Tuscaloosa and Chapel Hill was quite a bit smaller, actually. When I was an undergraduate, the university had 8,000 students and the town had 8,000 people. Gainesville, of course, was somewhat larger. Tuscaloosa was about the same size as Gainesville. And Tallahassee was a lot smaller too. So they were more similar than different at that time. I'd say football was big certainly at Gainesville and at Tuscaloosa, and Tallahassee. Less so at Chapel Hill. It's a basketball school. So they were pretty similar, really. I had a piece of advice when I was about to finish at FSU. One of the faculty members, when he found out I was going to the University of Alabama, he said, "Well, that's good school. It's great. I'm glad that you're going there." He said, "Although," and at that time I was, I guess, 27 years old, and he said, my only hesitation is that at your age, I think it might have been better to go to a university in a large city where you can make more contacts, network, and do all of that. But I guess I was used to the smaller atmosphere, and of course you get to know people a lot better in those smaller towns, not necessarily small, but smaller. So that was the only. And looking back, in a way, he was right, but I'm glad I did what I did.
And what was your kind of relationship like with the businesses in these cities when you, I mean, maybe not so much when you were in Chapel Hill, but once you became a professor and were teaching?
So yeah, in Tallahassee, I had that opportunity to work with the agriculture people. When I went to Tuscaloosa, I had the opportunity to do some consulting and also there I got to know a lot of business people because I was involved in fundraising for the College of Business at Alabama. So I got to travel around the state and interact with a lot of businesses, large and small, a lot of business people there. And then at other schools, at one school where I taught, they had something called the Small Business Institute, which is set up by the Small Business Administration to help businesses. And I headed that up at that school for uh, a couple of years. And there again, some consulting, some interaction with the business community uh, in Gainesville, and particularly when I went to UF. I didn't have much because in the management department at UF, there is an entrepreneurship program, which is within the management department, but it's a separate entity with separate courses, separate faculty, and so on. So I was in the regular management department, so I didn't have that much opportunity at UF. But obviously, I was in Gainesville, so I got to become familiar with a lot of the places.
Mhm. And were you always more interested in small businesses? You mentioned kind of starting with your friend's company at UNC and then the Small Business Institute also.
Yes, yes, I've always been interested in small business because it's so challenging, and I never really had the urge to work for a large company. If I'd stayed with my friend's company, which probably would have been a good thing because he's been tremendously successful. And but when I worked with him, he and I were it, and a secretary. We were it, and so I got to see it from the start, and that always interested me, the startup idea and how you build a business and that sort of thing. So yes, I've always been interested in small business. And I've taught small business management. I taught it at Santa Fe. I've taught it in some other places.
Mhm. And I guess keeping with the small business theme, what would you say are kind of the main differences between working with small businesses and working with larger corporations?
Small business people tend not to think they know all the answers. The larger businesses believe they do, and so it's more difficult if you go to a large business and you want them to change something. They're not as necessarily as anxious to do that as a small business because they think they know best in some cases, and in others they're just averse to change. Whereas a small business, if something's not going the way they would like, they're more willing to, in many cases, to consider new ideas and go in new directions. So that's another attractive aspect of small business for me, anyway. It's nice when people take your advice, and they're more likely to do that in small business.
Hmm. Interesting. Um, so shifting back to Gainesville a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
can you tell me about how you perceived the Gainesville business environment, the small businesses when you first arrived, when you started your master's degree, and then I guess we'll move into when you returned in I think you said in '94, right?
Right. Well, it was very different because back in the 60s, Gainesville was much more a town of small businesses. The big box stores didn't exist in Gainesville back then. And as I said, 34th Street was the western limit. So it was a lot more, there were a lot more small businesses around. And some of them grew into larger ones, others are long gone. When I came back in 94, of course, all had changed and Gainesville was much larger, UF was much larger, and the business community was much larger, including a lot of larger businesses, such as the big box stores and, Publix and other things that weren't really around in the 60s.
Mhm.
So there was a big difference.
And then moving from the mid 90s to when you retired in 2 years ago, I think you said, right?
Last year,
Last year.
24. Yeah.
So, what did you kind of notice Gainesville evolving, as you're a professor and as you're interacting with the town in that way?
Well, I saw many businesses come and go for various reasons over that time period.
Mm.
Some that were long established in Gainesville, but for one reason or another, didn't survive. For example, when I was here in the 60s, uh, one very successful business at that time was a place called Dub's.
Okay.
It was out on 13th Street. It was originally a steakhouse, but it evolved into being a nightclub. And they had a lot of big name entertainment and so on. And of course, at my age then, I was going to those places.
Mm.
And Dubs was extremely successful until about, I think it finally closed about 1990, and for a variety of reasons. But the club business, restaurants, things like that in Gainesville, um, I don't know the number, but I'm guessing there were more of those local, smaller restaurants and clubs back in the 60s than I found in the 90s when, the chains had taken over and places like Dub's were long gone. So it was a different environment.
And you mentioned Dubs. Are there any other kind of significant small businesses that you remember or were a success story or something that exemplifies kind of Gainesville culture, Gainesville, the spirit of Gainesville?
Well, of course, as I say, the things that stand out were the restaurants that and the clubs that were around back then, um, most of which didn't last. They for a variety of reasons. But I think, certainly as far as the student population is concerned, those kinds of businesses are what Gainesville means to them. And in fact, somebody was saying when they see students that come back to Gainesville as alumni after a period of time, uh, some of them ask, is such and such business still in Gainesville? So they were, and those types of businesses tend to be the restaurants and clubs
Mhm.
and things of that sort that they remember from their time as students,
Right.
and also businesses that were close to UF. I remember there was a small restaurant called Allen's Cubana that was over on 17th Street, just a block over from University. And it was quite popular when I was in school. In fact, I lived in that neighborhood back then. It's long gone, but I remember it all these years later
Mhm.
because it was a significant part of my being in Gainesville. And so those kinds of businesses, I think, make a big impression on students. And because Gainesville is so identified with students, that's one thing. I mean, there are obviously businesses in Gainesville that have nothing to do with students. There's another Gainesville out there,
Right.
and I've gotten to know some of that as well. But when you talk to people about Gainesville, the first thing that comes into their mind is UF and students.
Mhm.
So that's I think those kinds of businesses particularly exemplify Gainesville in a lot of people's minds.
And then I guess kind of conversely, not necessarily the success stories, but can you recall any types of businesses or industries that maybe struggled or failed in Gainesville or had difficulties? And what do you think kind of was the reasoning behind it, if there was, or anything like that?
Well, one was the Gainesville Mall, which was on 13th Street out by 23rd. It was the first mall in Gainesville, and it was the place to go for retail and for a long time. But then the Oaks Mall opened. Gainesville grew to the west, um, and the Gainesville Mall eventually disappeared. I mean, the shopping center's still there, but there's not, it's not, it's other things now. So that was one, and that isn't necessarily a small business, but it contained a lot of small businesses.
Right.
And so that was one place that went. Um, and, businesses fail for lots of reasons. Poor management is one. Not having the right mix. In marketing, we used to say that there's something called the so-called marketing mix, which is sometimes referred to as the 4 Ps, because it's product, price, promotion, and place. And any business to be successful has to develop what we call a sustainable competitive advantage. And the way to do that is to be outstanding in one or more of those 4 Ps. And if a business opens and is just a clone of some other business that already exists, they're not going to do well. If they're in the wrong location, as I said, Gainesville has shifted to the west in the last few decades. So the businesses that were out there have benefited from that. The ones that are north, less so. And also, the key to success for any business is developing that sustainable competitive advantage. And I'll give you an example. It's in Micanopy, so it's not specifically Gainesville, but there's a place in Micanopy called Pearl's Country Store.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether you're familiar with it.
Yes.
But, oh, are you? Okay. Are you part of the cult following?
No, but I know of it. I've passed by it
Yeah.
100
Well,
times.
I have to admit to be part of the cult following. So, because when going back and forth from Ocala to Gainesville, I would pass by it each time. But my point is, if you pass by it on 441, you'll think it's just another convenience store. And it looks like one. It's got gas pumps out front. It looks like, any other. But inside, it has a restaurant. And the restaurant has outstanding food. And that's not just my opinion. As I say, it has a cult following and it's packed, particularly at lunchtime. Well, see, that's product. In other words, they've developed their sustainable competitive advantage because they have a great product. To a lesser extent, place, which is location, because obviously there aren't many places in Micanopy to choose from. Blue highways out there, but there are not too many. And so they've been successful because they've developed this unique mix. And it is a convenience store. I mean, it does have all the convenience store items, but it's got this food component, this restaurant component that the average convenience store doesn't have. And it happens to be very good. And so that's an example of how you become successful. If it were just another convenience store, it might have done all right, because convenience store, their key to success is place or location. The word convenience, a convenience store is because it's right down the street. And if you just need a couple of items, then you go to a convenience store rather than going to Publix or, some other business. However, convenience stores normally are higher priced, so they're not competing on price. Products, you could get the products lots of other places. They don't promote themselves, most of them. Well, the large chain ones do, but not the small local ones. So really all they have going for them is location. And if they pick the right one, then it can do well. but not only convenience stores, but um, other types of businesses have failed because they were in the wrong place. If they had been somewhere else, they would have done all right. There are places in Gainesville, locations that I have seen go through one business after another, small business.
Mhm.
They come in and for some reason, and well, one reason they go there is because the rent is cheap. Well, it's cheap for a reason. And the reason is it's not a good location.
Yeah.
And so if you've got a business that relies on walk-in traffic and things of that sort, you've got to be somewhere that people can get to. And that's a reason, as I say, that some small businesses fail. They're in the wrong place. If they were in the right place and maybe spend a little more money on the rent and other things, they might do very well.
Mhm.
So, but try Pearls. You'll like it.
What would be your recommendation? What's your go-to meal there?
Oh, well, it's a barbecue place. I
Okay.
should say that. I get the barbecue chicken
Okay.
because I'm not supposed to have red meat you know, at my advanced age. So I get the chicken, but it's all good. It's all, in-house produced.
Awesome.
Very good. So that's and the mac and cheese
The mac and cheese. Okay.
is outstanding.
All right. I'll be sure next time I'm going by it. I'll be sure to
Okay.
stop it.
All right.
Um, and so you mentioned these locations that are seemingly haunted or consistently unsuccessful, and you
Right.
mentioned kind of location being that deciding factor. What can you remember about any of these sort of haunted locations and maybe where they were? Is it a consistent type of business that's going there, or anything else about those?
Well, some locations are difficult to get to for one reason or another, or they're on the wrong side of the street. If you, for a lot of people, 34th Street, for example, Archer Road, do you really want to try to navigate to the other side of Archer Road? It's just very difficult. So, on the other hand, you've got so much traffic past there that you're going to get some business from that. I've always thought personally that Butler Plaza is one of the most challenging um, shopping centers around the way it's laid out. And depending on where you are in Butler Plaza, from my personal experience, you may find it difficult to get to some other part of Butler Plaza simply because you don't know really how to get there from here. Uh, but yeah, location is key. You can be, and of course, in some cases, businesses and in a growing area like Gainesville, some businesses are adversely affected through no fault of their own if the city or the county or the state decide to tear up the road in front of their business for a prolonged period. And then, the business just evaporates. There are all kinds of uncontrollable things that can affect a business. For example, COVID caused quite a few businesses to close because they had long-standing businesses in Gainesville. Leonardo's, for example,
Mhm.
being one. Uh, they closed because of the effects of COVID and the lasting effect in the restaurant business of finding people to work there and that sort of thing.
Mhm. And you mentioned Butler Plaza. I know before it became Butler Plaza, there was an airstrip there, and I think
Right.
it over the period of 30 years that you've been in Gainesville, it's certainly grown and developed. Can you talk a little bit more about that, the Archer Road, Butler Plaza area
Well, I
specifically?
can remember the time on Archer Road when the only place of any note out there was a Wendy's,
Mhm.
which I think is still there,
Yeah.
but it was out by itself and the woods. And Archer Road back then was not anything like it is today. And but as I say, Gainesville just hadn't grown out that way back then. And yeah, Clark Butler had an amazing vision by developing Butler Plaza. It was, if he had to do it over again, I don't know whether he would have done it the same way, but the idea, because Butler Plaza has kind of grown in, in phases, and but he certainly saw the potential out there, and how Gainesville was growing and what Gainesville needed in the way of retail. And in fact, speaking of Butler Plaza, one unique aspect of Gainesville, which it shares with places like Tuscaloosa and Chapel Hill and so on, the Target store in Butler Plaza, I've been told that their big month, their biggest revenue month, is August. Now, the typical Target store is December, but because, and for obvious reasons, in Gainesville and in other college towns, August is the big month. People are moving back into town. They need stuff for their apartment and so on. So if you're the manager of the Gainesville Target, you've got a different set of challenges than the manager of Target in some other town that doesn't have a university. So, there are little quirks like that in Gainesville and other college towns that make them different in terms of how you run your business and when you run your business.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, someone, faculty member at UF was telling me one time that they try to do as much shopping as possible during Gator home football games because there's no traffic and it's just easy to get around. There again, that's another, unique aspect. If you're in Gainesville, in business in Gainesville, large or small, that there's going to be a dead period during Gator football games. That the summer is not going to be nearly what the fall and spring are. So any business in Gainesville has to deal with that phenomenon.
I've certainly been a victim of the back to school rush at Target as well.
Right.
And yeah, and I think that's definitely part of what makes Gainesville so unique is this um, prevalence of the student population. And I guess comparing that to you grew up in South Florida and West Palm Beach, sort of what kind of differences did you notice between, these heavily student populated areas and the sort of more residential areas like West Palm Beach?
Well, and of course, West Palm Beach back then was much smaller
Mm.
than it is now. I remember there were gaps between those towns in Palm Beach County, which there aren't anymore. But yeah, because West Palm Beach back then was a town of small businesses. I knew my friends that I went to high school with, and well, any school. Many of their parents had small businesses, and so you got used to that. You went to, shopping. I remember when Sears first opened in West Palm Beach. That was a big deal
Mm.
because there was no other place like it there, and people went to Sears because it was something different. But for the most part, it was a town of small businesses, and it was a great place to grow up. And then when I went to Gainesville, well, of course, I'd been to Chapel Hill and then back to Gainesville. So I guess I had become used to the smaller atmosphere in Chapel Hill. And Chapel Hill back then was a town of small businesses. So it was at that time, it was pretty much everywhere.
I grew up in Palm Beach County as well, so I kind of
Ah, where?
Delray, Boca Raton.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah. So a little bit
Well,
south.
as I said, I remember when there were gaps between Delray and Boca.
Hmm.
There was nothing,
Hmm.
and between Boynton and Delray,
Right.
all those towns, they were just separate entities. And now, of course, it's very different.
Right. And then of course shifting west also.
And shifting west. That's
Yep.
exactly right.
Yep.
Yeah, because again, in West Palm Beach, the Seaboard Railroad tracks were the western end of West Palm Beach, and that they're not that far
Right.
west. So yeah, it was very different, and um, it's uh, and I don't get down there enough these days to know
Mhm.
recent information about it. But from what I gather, it's for example, a lot of my friends that are still there have moved out of West Palm Beach and moved up to Jupiter and that part of the county, which when I was growing up was a fishing village. It didn't
Mm.
it didn't have much except the lighthouse.
Right.
And so in Florida, we see those things. Now you go to other parts of the country, you don't see those vast changes, and people tend to stay around. Most of my friends in high school, my close friends, went off to school. They didn't even go to, most of them didn't even go to school in Florida. They left Florida, as I did, and they didn't move back,
Mhm.
afterward to West Palm Beach at least. So that was very different. There weren't as many opportunities back then as there are now, but you could still start a small business and be successful.
And I guess as a whole, I mean, we've talked about it, but each of these different areas are having this shift from people owning small businesses, a lot of small businesses in the area, to this sort of these big box stores and these larger sort of chains. What do you notice about that, and what can you say was maybe the cause or anything like that? Have you noticed?
Well, for one thing, the big box stores have an advantage in that they're established brand names. So if you come to Gainesville, if you're from South Florida and you come to Gainesville to go to school, you know about Publix, you know about Walmart, you know about Target, you know about all these places. So there's no guesswork in going to those places. Whereas if you move to Gainesville from South Florida and you see this small business with a name that you don't know, and it may be in the type of business that you're familiar with, but you don't know what that business is about, then you may tend to go more to the brand names that you're familiar with and not even try that small business. So one thing that the small businesses in Gainesville, at least the ones that cater to students, need to do is to get the word out to the student community about the business and what it has and what it can offer them and that sort of thing, because they don't know, and the business typically doesn't have the promotional budget to be able to compete with the big box stores
Mhm.
in terms of advertising. And when talking about businesses to students at UF or elsewhere for that matter, you need to talk about businesses they're familiar with. It doesn't do any good to talk about some mom and pop operation that they've never heard of. You need to talk about businesses they know, which means in Gainesville that you these days that you tend to talk more about the big box stores and or businesses that are very close to the UF campus that students may be familiar with,
Mhm.
um, like Burrito Brothers and businesses like that. Um, but Chipotle will, you know, raise more interest because more people are familiar with it,
Right.
maybe even when they come to Gainesville. So that's, you know, and students these days, one change I've noticed, and particularly at UF, is that I'd say the majority of students that I've come in contact with tend to want to go with larger organizations when they graduate. And that makes it very difficult for some small businesses to recruit and keep people they might like to keep. For example, students that work at a business in Gainesville while they're in school. And the business may be very impressed with them and want to keep them, but the student sees this opportunity at a large business, and probably in many cases not in Florida, and they want to go that way. When I follow up on some students and see, where they are now, a lot of them are it used to be Atlanta. Atlanta used to be the magnet for students from Florida. And it still is to some degree, but I see more and more students, saw more and more students going to New York, Chicago, and if they're in banking, they go to Charlotte. It's because it's very attractive. Now, they don't necessarily stay there. And I've had some students, for example, I taught strategic management to accounting students at UF. They're required to take certain management courses as a part of their Master of Accounting curriculum. So I taught strategic management and organizational behavior to accounting students. And they're very interested in the Big Four accounting firms. And the Big Four recruit extensively at UF. And so a lot of them go with the Big Four. Very few of them go with local firms or regional firms, which makes it very hard. In fact, my own CPA is in a small CPA firm in Gainesville. And he tells me, they would love to recruit UF accounting graduates, but the accounting graduates aren't really interested because they see the Big Four. The interesting thing is a lot of them don't stay at the Big Four for very long. They go up there, they find out, and then some of them do come back to Florida. And sometimes they come back in a very different kind of business than they were trained for. I can recall one accounting graduate, UF accounting graduate, got his master's of accounting, got his CPA, went with one of the Big Four in New York. And he now has returned to Florida and he's running a bagel shop in South Florida. Now it's his family business, but when he was at UF, he had no idea that he'd be running a bagel shop, even though his family was in that business. So, you get those kinds of differences. So there is some boomerang effect where students leave Florida but then come back. And sometimes they do come back to smaller businesses like a bagel shop or a smaller CPA firm, or whatever the business may be. So that's a change, I think, over the years that I've seen more of that kind of thing happen.
And do you think that for your students, do you think that starting at one of these bigger firms and moving, kind of going to big and then coming back to small, do you think that gives them some experience that maybe helps them in the small
Oh
business
yeah,
setting?
oh no question. Yes, it can, and I think it's a wise decision for many of them, because they do get exposed to lots of different kinds of businesses. They get to network. In fact, I've known some that have started out, for example, at one of the Big Four accounting firms in New York, Chicago, wherever. And because of the contacts they made and because of the knowledge they gained, they've now gone into consulting or other kinds of activities in that area, in New York or in Atlanta or wherever they happen to be. So yes, I think they can get great. Now, banking is the same way. I've known quite a few students who've gone in banking and stayed, 2 or 3 years, something like that, and then moved on to something else. Because banking and accounting both expose a person to many different kinds of businesses. It's kind of like when I went back as a special student, took all those business courses to see which one I liked. They can do the same thing when they go to these large firms because they're dealing with so many different kinds of businesses. So yeah, it's a great idea for many of them to do that.
And I guess, staying with your students, what have you noticed have been some common misconceptions or ideas that students might have about business or small businesses in particular when they're entering your courses?
Well, I'd say one possible misconception is while they may have worked in a business while they were in school, even high school or wherever, what they haven't really, in many cases, experienced is the management side of the business. You know, they've worked there and they've dealt with managers, but they don't really have a full understanding of what a manager does and the challenges of being a manager. And of course, that term manager is sometimes misused. You know, it's sometimes people have the title manager when they're really glorified, you know, just maybe an employee who's been there longest or something like that. So they don't necessarily understand that side of it. And for that reason, they sometimes don't understand if a manager asks them to do something, why they should do it, why they, you know, what's the manager up to, that kind of thing. So I'd say that's one misconception that many of them have. And the ideal manager, of course, is like a coach. You know, a coach. The difference between a coach and a manager is that a coach is a kind of teacher, whether it's in sports or in business or wherever, and you try to develop, as a manager, you try to develop the people who are working with you. And some managers don't do any of that. And some managers, you know, think all you have to do is order people around. And these days, that doesn't go over very well. That's another big change in business over the years. You get a lot fewer of managers of that type because simply employees don't respond to it. They don't like to be dictated to. And so managers have had to evolve over the years as employees have evolved. So, yeah, I'd say that's one of the big misconceptions that some of them have is not understanding what managers do.
Uh, can you give any examples of a specific Gainesville business that you used in your course as a case study or were connected with in through teaching or anything like that?
Well, as I said earlier, in order to get the students to relate to it, you need to use a business they're familiar with, and they're more familiar with the larger businesses, you know, the chains and that sort of thing. You can use smaller local businesses occasionally, but the big businesses really resonate more. And of course, one reason is because some of the students are working at the larger businesses.
Mhm.
Now, I have had occasions when I knew a student worked for a smaller business in Gainesville, I would ask them to tell the class, you know, something about what that business was and how it evolves and so on. But generally, you get the better response talking about the Publixes and you know, the Walmarts and businesses like that.
Sure. And
Although I do recall you can relate anecdotes from even a large business that students can relate to. I sometimes have said to students, um, you know, that I tell them the story of the student I had who worked at Best Buy out in Butler Plaza.
Mhm.
And he apparently was a very valued employee. He was a good student, and apparently Best Buy thought he was an excellent employee. And they wanted him to go into their management program. And he told me, he said, you know, it's an opportunity, but he said, I don't want to do that. I don't want to go in there. And it wasn't because it was management. He had a different kind of reason. He said, I know that I could be successful in their management program. But he said, if I am successful, I'd have to move up the ladder in Best Buy. And eventually, I'd get transferred to Best Buy headquarters, which is in Minnesota. And he said, I'm a Florida boy. It's cold up there. I'm not going to Minnesota. So you get things like that. You see that affect the decision, whether it's a large business or a small business. People make decisions about their future based on what they see from that business. And while he probably could have done very well at Best Buy, if they'd been headquartered somewhere else, you know, Florida businesses have a great advantage in that respect. Although Florida generally is a low pay state. It's been said that many Florida businesses pay people in sunshine rather than in money because it is a low pay state compared to a lot of others. In fact, that CPA I was telling you about, my CPA, said they had someone from New York who was moving to Gainesville for family reasons and applied with them for a job as a CPA. And as I said, it's a small firm. And they said, well, we really like to have you. But he said, you have to realize we couldn't pay you a fraction of what you were making in New York, even though the cost of living is much lower in Gainesville. But, and so that's another barrier they face is competing, even though it's Florida, they can't necessarily attract, and particularly small businesses can't necessarily attract the kind of people they need because they can't pay them enough.
Right. Um, were you ever able to connect any of your students with local small businesses and either for mentorship programs, internships, projects, or even for work after
Well,
graduation?
that in at UF, that kind of thing is mainly handled through the entrepreneurship program, which I wasn't involved with. So the short answer is no at UF because they deal with all of that. Um, and but at other places, I have done a lot of that when I could.
Mhm.
Um, and it's rewarding to see. And some students have gone on within the business that they were connected to. Uh, and one time at UF, I did have some students who were actually accounting students who came to me with a business idea and wanted to talk about it and get my advice and things like that. Um, so you do get some of that, but as I say, at UF, I didn't really have the opportunity to do too much of that.
Um, we talked a little bit about student aspirations and wanting to move towards the bigger corporations. Um, what other changes, if you have seen any changes in sort of the aspirations of the students, maybe a shift in, for example, from retail to tech or something like that?
Oh, there's definitely been a shift away from retail, no question. In fact, I can remember early in my teaching career, um, to some people, marketing was retail. That was the only thing that mattered. These days, if students who go into uh, businesses that have some retail connection don't actually go into the retail side of it. For example, I had a UF student last year who graduated and went with Procter and Gamble, which obviously has a lot of products in retail stores, but he went with the corporate side of Procter and Gamble, not the retail side. So I have definitely seen a shift away from retail, not so much toward tech, although obviously many businesses these days are using so much tech. There has been this shift toward um, more, and there never was much of an interest in manufacturing, and part of that is that Florida doesn't have much compared to some other states. But there seems to be more of an interest in consulting opportunities and service businesses of one kind or another, not retail, but
Mhm.
other types of services. So that definitely has happened.
And why do you think that is? Do you think it's because these larger and these consulting jobs maybe are more um, high paying or safer, or what do you think the driving force is
Well,
behind
that's
that?
part of it, particularly in the short run.
Mhm.
I think that's part of it. Also, um, well, for example, Publix is a promote from within company. And most of the people, even the CEO of Publix, started out stocking shelves at
Mhm.
Publix. It worked his way up. And one of the reasons that Publix does that is because students, particularly at UF and other places, look at the grocery industry and say, I don't want to work in a grocery store. They may have worked there when they were in high school or something like that. They say, I don't want to make a career in groceries. It's just not glamorous enough for whatever reason they have. So Publix and other businesses too solve that problem by promoting from within. The problem with that is that it takes a while to develop someone if you promote from within. And if you have a need in some area and you don't have the people in house to fill it, then what do? You've either got to violate your promote from within policy or you don't do whatever it is that you needed. I sometimes use the example. I've been told that when the year 2000 was coming around, Publix at that time had something like 750 stores or some number like that. And they had a goal of having 1,000 stores by the year 2000. They didn't achieve that goal, not because they didn't have the money to build the stores, but because they didn't have the people to run them. Because with the promote from within policy, you've got to wait. You can't hire managers from the outside, even from Winn-Dixie or some other chain. You don't hire from the outside to run those stores. You want Publix people, which means you've got to have the people in the pipeline, and they just didn't have them at that time. And so, you get into situations like that you've got a great objective over here, but you can't achieve it with the resources that you have, whether they're human or financial or whatever kind of resources.
And are there any other changes that you noticed within your students over the 30 years of your teaching? Whether it's, through technology, habits, interests, or anything like that?
Oh yeah, technology, definitely. And in fact, I taught quite a few online courses at UF. I think I taught something like 40 some online courses in
Hmm.
addition to the classroom. And that's a totally different environment. You don't really get to know the students
Hmm.
nearly as well. Um, but it serves a need. Uh, it, that was unthinkable back when I started teaching and even in the 90s when I came back to the Gainesville area. And there was well, I mean, the internet was just starting back in the mid 90s. And the students were not, phones were dial up, and the ones who had phones had internet back then. And, there wasn't the tremendous proliferation of technology that there is now. And of course, I've had to play catch up because I'm not of that tech generation, yet the students, particularly the current students, have never known a world without it. And so that's been probably one of the biggest changes. In lots of ways, it's changed teaching, even things like PowerPoint.
Hmm.
We never had that back when I was early years of
Hmm.
teaching. And you stood at the lectern and you talked and wrote things on the board and that kind of thing. And the exams, were paper exams. One thing that has changed because of technology and other reasons is that I found that people give a lot more multiple choice exams these days than they used to. They used to give essay exams much more than now. But essay exams are a pain to grade, and so people kind of were welcome for some other opportunity. Plus, another advantage of particularly the electronic multiple choice exams is that the students get their scores immediately.
Right.
They don't have to wait around for the instructor to grade their papers. So that's been probably the biggest change, technology.
Mhm. And do you think that certain topics or materials translate better in an in-person lecture or even courses versus online lessons?
Well, yeah, I think as far as the give and take between students and instructor is definitely better in the classroom
Mhm.
because you're face to face. You're seeing the people. Well, you're seeing them face to face online too, but people are much more hesitant to say something online. And of course, in many cases, the online courses are not live in the sense that, the lectures have been previously recorded. So you're not getting that immediate feedback. But
Mhm.
even if it is live, back during COVID when we were doing lots of live Zoom internet, you get very few student questions. Um, and of course, also, many of the students would blank their video in Zoom. So you didn't even see them. They could see the instructor. So there's definitely a lot more personal interaction and give and take um, in the classroom than online. On the other hand, you can do so many more things with online, and you can do it in a way that makes perhaps the course more meaningful, more interesting. So there are pluses and minuses to both of them.
Mhm.
And of
And then,
course, with the classroom, you have to show up. Both instructor and students have to show up to class, and that can sometimes be a challenge. Um, and in fact, I always had an attendance policy for my classroom classes. It was, I think, a fairly, um, you know, loose attendance policy, but still there was one. And every day I'd pass around an attendance sheet.
Mhm.
Uh, and because I knew if I didn't, there would be some students who would just not come. And uh, and even from the instructor's point of view, there were days when, I might have rather been somewhere else too. But you have to do that. With online, if the student wants to watch, I know well, the first course I taught at UF was the Introduction to Management, Principles of Management course, which is the so-called platform course at 1,300 students. And it was taught in a lecture room in Bryant Hall that I think held 100 students, yet there were 1,300 enrolled. And I would get on average about 25 students that would actually show up in person for the class. 25 out of 1,300. And so, and even the size, there were 25 people in a room that seats 100. That affects the dynamic too, because a lot of them sit in the back, or they're spread out. And so you don't get, there are lots of factors that go into that. But all the basic business courses at UF are taught that way.
Mhm.
The basic course. Then when you get into the others, you're more in the traditional classroom size and things of that sort. But yeah, fortunately, with that course, I had a lot of TAs that helped me because 1,300 students, that's an unmanageable number if you have to do it all yourself.
Yeah, you might have had to start teaching in the basketball arena or something like that.
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
And what were some of your favorite courses to teach? I know you mentioned you had some classes with master's accounting students and also these intro courses as well.
Well, I particularly enjoy strategic management, which I taught to not only the accounting students, but I taught it to undergraduate management students as well. The accounting was a graduate course, but I particularly enjoyed that because it brought a lot. You bring every area of business into that, so I could bring marketing in and finance and even well, they were accounting students, so I could use accounting examples
Hmm.
um, in those courses. The undergraduates, of course, I could bring in um, marketing management and so on. And so I particularly enjoyed that course. Um, Organizational behavior, human resources, um, they all have their attractive features. Students can relate more um, to some courses than others, again, for reasons I mentioned previously. But yeah, I'd say of all the courses that I taught at UF, I'd say probably strategic management was my favorite.
And then turning to COVID, we mentioned it briefly, but what were sort of the biggest changes you noticed in the classrooms? And you mentioned the shift to more online teaching models, and then also in Gainesville and Micanopy, Ocala, in the whole kind of the region.
Well, when COVID happened, the change at UF was literally overnight. I taught a classroom class on Thursday afternoon, and by Friday morning, UF had gone completely online. And the semester had about another month to run. So with the same group, we had to make the transition from classroom to online immediately. There was no adjustment time. On the other hand, students, and when COVID really um, got going, and students were nervous about being on campus, and many of them went home, and UF was like a ghost town, even though the semester was still going on. Then you had to get into remote learning. Students could be in South Florida or wherever they were and take the courses from there. Um, and students, even in Gainesville, would stay in their apartments because they didn't want to get exposed. I had to teach with a mask on when I was back in the classroom because once we went through that initial phase of COVID where everything was online, they began resuming some classroom classes. But I had to wear a mask to teach, which isn't fun. And many of the students, of course, were masked. And if anyone in the classroom coughed or something like, everyone would immediately turn around and look at them and kind of move away and be concerned. So yeah, COVID disrupted lots of things, and not only in the classroom, but as we said earlier, in business and in the area. Um, it was a major change, which no one had any experience going through. So you can almost separate the pre-COVID time, my pre-COVID time at UF, versus the post-COVID time, because they were very different. And of course, by the time COVID ran its course, the student body had turned over enough that you didn't have the same group of people that you'd had before COVID. In fact, some of them, when they're about to graduate, say, I really enjoyed my time at UF, and I'm going to come back to Gainesville every year after I leave. Well, what they find in many cases is when they come back the first year, the second year, they see a lot of their friends. They see a lot. By the time you get out to the fourth and fifth year, they come back to Gainesville and they find they don't know many people, because the students have moved on. And you see, that's another blessing or curse for businesses in Gainesville, because on the one hand, you have a new group of people coming in every year, and at Target and other places. You've got a group of people coming in, but you've also got a group of people leaving. So even if you have people who were really good customers of yours when they were students in Gainesville, they're gone all of a sudden, or good employees are gone. And so, as I say, the fact that the Gainesville student population turns over every 4 years, give or take, uh, can be a good thing in that you get this new crop of people, but it can be a great negative in that you lose established customers and established students for that matter. So that's a unique aspect of a university town. Now, obviously, you wouldn't find that as much at UCF, USF, FAU, places like that. Because, well, maybe a little bit at FA. Well, I don't know. You would know better than I in Boca whether that would be a big thing. But certainly at UCF and USF, being in Orlando and Tampa, um, it's not as pronounced because they're in large metropolitan areas. But
Yeah,
in
it's certainly the same at FAU. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So Gainesville, towns like Gainesville have that unique feature that businesses have to take into account in their planning. And planning is so important in business. And that's another effect of COVID because COVID knocked all the plans, just completely obliterated them and they had to start over. And some businesses just couldn't do it.
And you mentioned kind of that planning and having to sort of adapt to that transient nature of Gainesville. What sort of strategies have you seen been more effective or less effective in kind of um, bringing in that new crop of students every year while the frequent customers are graduating?
Well, there is a concept, well, it's more than a concept, it's a reality of the so-called newcomer market. And one way that businesses, large or small, can help themselves is to become very proactive in welcoming new students, for example, reaching out to them one way or another. And it would vary by the type of business and where the students are living and that sort of thing. But reaching out to them, giving them deals, if they come in and order this or by such and such a date, they get a special price or some kind of deal to get them in the door. Because when students come to Gainesville, you probably know this when you came to Gainesville. How much did you know about businesses in Gainesville?
Not much.
No. And so if a particular type of business reached out to you and said, here we are, this is what we offer, and we'd really like you to come in and try us, and to sweeten that pot, we're going to make you this kind of deal, chances are you at least would have tried it.
Mhm.
And if they'd done their other work correctly, you could all of a sudden be a loyal customer
Right.
and never have tried anything else. So rather than just sitting back and waiting for the students to arrive, and this would be in July as we're recording this would be the time of year that Gainesville businesses need to be thinking about, okay, we got a new crop coming in August. How are we going to reach out to them? And one way, put flyers on their windows. So obviously a lot of them get thrown away, but maybe somebody will read them
Mhm.
or go to apartment complexes or anywhere the students might gather, any connection you have. Maybe you have students as employees who can spread the word to their friends, and the friends spread the word to other friends. And so there are lots of things, but in a town like Gainesville, where you've got this new crop of people, you've got to do it. Also, you could even encourage people who are leaving Gainesville, but who know a friend or a family member who's coming to Gainesville. Get them to recommend your business to that friend. I had a student one time that was about to graduate who told me that his brother was going to be coming to UF the following year. And so that's a situation where the student graduating could pass along to his brother, hey, I enjoyed going here and there in Gainesville. And his brother would probably at least try it
Mhm.
when he came to Gainesville. How long do you think it took you to become familiar with Gainesville businesses?
Probably close to a year, I would say.
Yeah, I would think freshman year. I mean, there's so many adjustments to make in freshman year
Mhm.
at any school. But you not only have to adjust to the university, you have to adjust to the community. And I think a year is probably a reasonable time uh, to expect students to become familiar enough.
Mhm.
But the business can speed up that process if they
Yeah.
are proactive and go after the student, not just sit back and wait for them to find them.
I think you also mentioned something that was interesting too, is that while Gainesville is this transient town, there are these connections. I know you mentioned your father went to UF.
Yeah.
I don't have any family who went to UF, but my sister might want to go there in a couple of years. And I know lots of my classmates and friends had parents or an aunt or uncle who went to UF, and they're kind of in that chain of UF students. So I don't know, is there anything that you've seen at UF or in Gainesville in particular that kind of keeps bringing students of different generations back?
Well, legacy certainly helps. Football games, uh, because I remember as a kid, we came to Gainesville for football games. And I can remember walking down University Avenue
Mhm.
to the swamp, which back then was a lot less grandiose than it is now. But I don't mean the swamp restaurant, I mean the
Right, right.
stadium. And so I can remember that and I can remember staying at a motel, which was on 13th Street at the edge of town. And that was 23rd Street,
Okay.
what is now 23rd or 23rd Avenue. I got turned around because Gainesville streets and avenues run the opposite way from Ocala and Miami and other places
Mhm.
I'm familiar with. The East West Street, 23rd Avenue, I guess it is. That was the edge of town. And I can remember as a kid when we were staying at that motel, looking out 13th Street, which was 441, of course,
Mhm.
and there was nothing. It was just open land, and so, but I remember those things about Gainesville. So you're kind of, if you have a family member who's gone to Gainesville, then you can educate them in lots of different ways. And maybe when their time comes, they'll find Gainesville an attractive destination. In my case, when I was getting ready to go to undergraduate school, I wanted to get out of Florida. I'd been here all my life and just want something different. And as I said, my group of friends, most of them were going out of state. As it turned out, um, something like four of my friends from high school ended up going to Chapel Hill as I did. And so I had a built-in group there. And the reason, by the way, here's another thing that can influence it. The reason I went to Chapel Hill, one of the reasons was we had always gone to North Carolina on vacation in the summer to the mountains.
Mhm.
So North Carolina was always kind of a second state to me. And so when I was looking out of state to decide where to go, North Carolina was an obvious choice. And even though Chapel Hill is not in the mountains,
Right.
but and I'm glad I did. I think it was good. And North Carolina is different enough from Florida that it was a good experience to go through that.
Mhm.
But as I say, I ended up eventually coming back to Florida.
Mhm. And you mentioned that a lot of your friends in high school went out of state. Have you noticed in your students over the time of you teaching, did you notice more students coming from in Florida in certain periods or more students from out of Florida over time?
Well, I would say in terms of their overall background, I think probably more were from originally from outside Florida. They may live in Florida now,
Mhm.
but they came to Florida from somewhere else and then came to UF or wherever. Um, but as time has gone on, I'd say there were more people who were born and raised in Florida because as far as grown, there are more people and more young people who were here. And yeah, I'd say the trend is now is more people who were, who grew up in Florida one way or another.
So, Gainesville as a whole, outside of the university, what other major institutions or industries have you noticed that have been present and have shaped Gainesville over time, whether that's maybe healthcare or certain other industries?
Healthcare, the growth of UF Health is amazing. I mean, it's been, again, back when I first was in Gainesville, yes, there was a hospital, but it wasn't anything. It was just a hospital, and so that's been one area. Gainesville has become such a health center,
Mhm.
and now UF Health is expanding in different areas of the state. So yeah, that's one big change. Technology, Gainesville, for example, there's a place out on Hawthorne Road called GTech,
Mhm.
which is Gainesville Technology Education Center. And it was developed, and I taught a couple of classes out there, but it was developed to as a business incubator for startups, business startups in the technology field. And of course, there's so many people in Gainesville that are connected to technology one way or the other that I think that too is a growing area for Gainesville to develop a technology hub. Also in Gainesville, I think in the future, Gainesville is starting to develop, I think, as a retirement destination
Hmm.
for some people. And one group that appeals to are UF graduates. They went to school here, they left, they went off, had their careers, but they want to retire. And so why not go back to Gainesville
Mhm.
and where they can go, be in the Gator Nation and go to the football games and have the vibe that they had when they were a student. So I think that's a growth area for Gainesville is retirement. It's not thought of as a retirement
Mhm.
destination, but I think more and more that may be, and that's happened too, by the way, at some of these other schools where I've been, that particularly in the college towns,
Mhm.
that people want to go back and relive their
Mhm.
college experience several decades later.
Mhm.
So that's a possibility. And also, we currently don't know what's going to happen with higher education in terms of research funds and all of that. So it's conceivable that over time that some components of UF may need to shrink because of things beyond their control that um, just may not make it as attractive. So it's remotely conceivable over time that UF may have a somewhat less dominant position in Gainesville
Mhm.
than it traditionally has had,
Mhm.
because Gainesville could be developing in other directions.
Yeah, and with the healthcare system being so well developed and it is attractive, I'm sure, for people who are retiring to have that resource nearby as well.
Also, of course, one thing about university towns, they have people in them who are overqualified for a lot of the jobs that exist in that community. Um, and as a result, they may not be able to, people who have advanced degrees and things like that may either have to leave Gainesville and go somewhere else to make use of their degree, or they have to accept some lesser position than they actually could do because Gainesville, being the size city it is a limitation as to how many jobs are available for people in certain fields, as opposed to, again, UCF, USF, UFAU, places that are in larger metropolitan areas. There's simply more jobs out there and more jobs that require the kinds of skills that university graduates would have. So it's conceivable that Gainesville could develop more of that over time. But you have a lot of highly educated people in Gainesville, um, and they sometimes have difficulty if they want to stay in Gainesville. They have difficulty finding a job that fits with them.
We touched briefly on Butler Plaza a little bit earlier
Mm-hmm.
and Clark Butler. Could you speak a little bit more to that development and any other kind of significant figures or development in the history of Gainesville that have changed the city in that way?
Well, Celebration Point was supposed to be a big changer, and to be honest, I have not been to Celebration
Mm.
Point, so I don't know from a personal standpoint about it. Apparently, from what I hear, it hasn't worked out as well as some people thought it would. I don't know why, because I haven't investigated it thoroughly. Um, but the Butler Plaza model seems to have worked very well. And maybe it was a case of Butler, Clark Butler being in the right place at the right time, where he could develop his concept at a time when Gainesville didn't really have anything else to match it. Maybe, uh, and I don't know this, I'm just speculating. Maybe people don't see enough difference. Remember, I said a business has to have a sustainable competitive advantage. Maybe people don't see Celebration Point as having a sustainable competitive advantage over Butler Plaza, for example. In which case they may not go there. And maybe it's the business mix, in the various places. I don't know. But uh, being in the right place at the right time means a lot. But you got to figure that out. Sometimes businesses blunder into that situation by accident. But if you can foresee, a successful business has to have vision. They have to be looking, when I taught strategic management, typical strategy is 2 to 5 years ahead.
Mm.
And so you're not looking from a planning perspective, you're not looking at Gainesville in 2025. You're looking at Gainesville in 2027 to 2030. And what's Gainesville going to be like then? And I have said to classes, I said, think back in your situation 5 years ago. Did you know you'd be where you are now?
Absolutely not.
Did you know you'd be sitting in, at UF taking
Absolutely
this
not.
course and so on? They're not, you don't know. And so you turn that around and say, where are you going to be 5 years from now? Well, that's the problem. Well, see, yeah, and that's the problem businesses face.
Mm.
It's not where you are now, it's not where you've been, but where are you going?
Yeah.
And you need to have a plan to get there.
Mhm.
And the advantage of strategic management is the strategy is your plan. You have your objective. So you have to have an a quantifiable objective
Mhm.
somewhere out in the future. And then you have to develop a plan to meet it. And sometimes you can meet it. I've used the example of suppose you want to go from Gainesville to Orlando and you're catching a plane or something. You've got to think about, when your plane's going to leave. When are you going to leave Gainesville? How are you going to travel? Are you going to take your own car? Are you going to ride with somebody? What route are you going to take? The obvious route is I-75 and the turnpike. Yeah, suppose you get out there on I-75 or the turnpike, you're driving down the road and up ahead you see all these taillights. There's been an accident. Not your fault. You're not involved in the accident, but you've got nowhere to go. You just have to sit out there. And as a result, you didn't cause the accident, but you may miss your plane because of something that happened along the way that you didn't plan for and couldn't control. So that strategy you have to adjust and tweak it as the time goes on in order to achieve your objective. Maybe if you had left Gainesville earlier, if you'd taken a different route, uh, you might have made your plane. Or if you'd scheduled the plane at a different time, anything that you could have done. But that's in hindsight. But what you have to do is try to think ahead and figure that out.
No, I've had that exact scenario happen to me, but luckily my plane got delayed leaving Orlando, so
Oh,
it all worked out.
okay, good, good. Okay.
Yeah, but you mentioned, in the spirit of looking to the future and planning ahead, what do you see kind of as the future of Gainesville or as UF or for UF, and what have you kind of noticed now that you've taken a step back from
Well, for one thing, I'm enjoying not having to travel to Gainesville multiple times a week. Nothing against Gainesville. It's just that, going back and forth from Ocala, it's except for Pearls, it's a difficult, uh, as I get older, it's proven more demanding. But no, I think Gainesville has a great future. Obviously, if I were looking at Gainesville and saying, where's the next big area of Gainesville, it's clearly to the west of Gainesville. It's not going to go south because of Paynes Prairie,
Right.
So it's pretty much limited there. It hasn't really taken off all that far north or east. So, Gainesville to Newberry one day may be like Delray to Boca.
Right.
It's just solid city.
Mhm.
And if you're a business in Newberry, you need to be planning for that. Or if you're a business in Gainesville, you need to think, what kind of presence do I need to have out toward Newberry so that I can take advantage of all the people that are moving in that direction? So things like that are going to change Gainesville. It's and some of the things we talked about with technology and possibly the retirement community type of thing. Gainesville, if you come back to Gainesville in as many years as I was away from Gainesville, you're not going to be able to recognize it. It's just, in fact, I had a friend that I went to school with at UF who had gone on to teaching, and the marketing department had him back because he made a name for himself in the marketing field, and they had him back about 3 years ago to talk to the faculty and doctoral students and so on. And he hadn't been back in Gainesville in many, many years, and he couldn't believe it. It was so different. He and his wife tried to look for the place they lived when they were first married in Gainesville, and they couldn't find it. They had no idea where it was.
Yeah.
And, back then when he and I were in school, the entire business school was in one building, Matherly Hall,
Hmm.
which, by the way, was not air conditioned back then. So I literally sweated through a lot of the classes uh, that I took there. But now the business school has 5 or 6 buildings, of which Matherly Hall is one. Well,
Right.
not anymore, but until very recently, Matherly was one of them. But that's changed. The the role of UF as an institution has changed. It's much more, um, I don't know what the right word is, prestigious maybe, than it probably was back when I was originally. I mean, it's always been prestigious in Florida,
Mhm.
but I think it's more prestigious outside of Florida now too. Um, so that has changed, and that has drawn more people to Gainesville over time. And um, so, Gainesville certainly has a future. It's not going to be like it has been any more than any. I mean, I remember Boca when there was hardly anything there except the Boca Raton Club. That was it. And look at it now. So, or West Palm Beach, and all these towns have changed so much. Um, I'm sometimes a little envious of people who grew up in some other parts of the country, and they can go back to their hometown, and it looks exactly like it was when they grew up there, and all their friends are still there, and things haven't changed much. In a way, that's appealing, and yet that isn't going to happen in Florida. It's a very different environment.
Hmm.
So Gainesville is going to change, and it's it's difficult to see into the future very far, but that's what businesses have to do. Not focus on the here and now, and certainly not the past, but where are you going to be 2 years from now, 5 years from now? Um, and in a dynamic environment like Gainesville, that's a much harder task than it would be in some town in some other state where things are pretty much the same there now as they were 20 years ago.
And do you think part of that is from the transient nature from the students, or what do you think
Part
is
of it,
pushing that?
part of it's the transient nature of the students, and for that matter, the transient nature of the state.
Hmm.
The supposedly 1,000 people a day move to Florida, but something like 300 move out. And that, by the way, seems to be increasing
Hmm.
because the cost of living has gone up so much, hurricanes, all kinds of reasons. People are leaving Florida. And so, yeah, I mean, Florida as a state is a very dynamic place. And so it's that makes it much more difficult to plan. And whether you're in Gainesville or Boca or wherever, it's much more difficult in Florida to do that. But certainly, Gainesville presents its unique challenges as a university town. Tallahassee, of course, has 2 universities and state government.
Hmm.
And so in Tallahassee, it's maybe slightly muted as opposed to Gainesville because of state government,
Hmm.
which is going to be there regardless.
And I don't know if you've been back to the other universities where you spent time, but have you noticed the same kind of prominence of this change in Chapel Hill and Tuscaloosa and other?
Oh, yeah. Well, I haven't been to Tuscaloosa in quite a while. I have been to Chapel Hill in recent times. And oh, yeah, there's a part of the campus that looks exactly like it did when I was there. Very old buildings and that sort of thing. But there's a part, if I had to find my way around Chapel Hill now, I couldn't do it, except for the immediate campus area that I was familiar with. um, it's changed so much. And there again, Chapel Hill is changing for many of the same reasons that Gainesville is. UNC Health now is a big component there.
Mm,
They and UF Health have followed pretty much the same path in terms of expansion
mhm,
and
mm,
size and everything like that, and also technology and retirement and all the other things I mentioned with Gainesville. You could also apply to Chapel Hill, and of course, my friend that I was involved with business, he still is a good friend. I hear from him all the time, and uh, he's a huge supporter of the University of North Carolina, financially and otherwise. And so he keeps me abreast of what's going on there. So even though I've been to Chapel Hill a few times in recent years, although there was a 40-year gap when I didn't go back to Chapel Hill.
mm.
But in recent years, I've been back a few times thanks to pressure from my friend to come back and visit. Uh, I have been back, and yeah, it's many. You could say that many of the same things about Chapel Hill that you could say about Gainesville.
Mm.
Yeah.
And you mentioned going to visit Chapel Hill a little bit, and and now that you're retired, what has been your life like away from teaching?
Well, for one thing, as I mentioned, after having to go to Gainesville multiple times a week for the last 30 years, I'm enjoying just staying at home more. Um, and my friend calls me periodically and said, "When are you coming up to North Carolina?" Well, I'll be up there. Too hot right now. I'll get up there. And I do want to go, and I do want to, see my friends and so on. But on the other hand, I'm just enjoying staying put for a while. And
Mhm,
also, catching up on things that I haven't had time to do. There's always things to be done around the house and other projects that, I just haven't had time to deal with,
mhm,
that I'm now can do. And, and I saw a t-shirt that someone was wearing the other day that said retirement. I do what I want when I want. And that's pretty accurate. And I like that.
yeah.
Uh,
And I'm sure it's great not having to, you get an extra, hour and a half, 2 hours a day without commuting.
oh yeah, oh absolutely. Well, it was a 45-minute trip one way from my house, 37.2 miles from my house to UF campus. 45-minute drive up 440. Went 441,
Mhm,
not 75, because my house and UF are both closer to 441, and it's a lot less stressful driving 441.
mhm,
But yeah, it was an hour and a half a day, back and forth. And so, yeah, I gained an hour and a half by doing that. And of course, you can, as I say, you can do, when I was asked to do this interview, and they said what times would be good, and I said basically any time. I can do this. Uh, there are a couple of minor restrictions, but I can basically do the interview anytime. So that's a good feeling. Although, I do miss the people at UF to some degree, the faculty, staff, students. Of course, the students now that a year's gone by, and most of the ones I were teaching have taught were juniors, seniors, or graduate students. So most of them are gone by
mhm.
now,
Yeah.
as far as the students go. But yeah, it's good. They say when it's time to retire, and I think that's accurate. And my time came, so I took advantage of it.
Um, if you were advising a young entrepreneur looking to start a business or something in Gainesville today, what would be your most important piece of advice to them?
Well, my most important advice is if they already know what kind of business they want, and usually people have some idea, Some people, for example, like to turn a hobby into a business.
Mhm.
And so if they have an idea what kind of business they want, then probably my top piece of advice would be what's going to be your sustainable competitive advantage? What will you do that sets you apart? I sometimes have asked classes, how many pizza places do you think there are in Gainesville? And, whatever number they gave me, I would say, do you think there's room for one more? And some of them would say, oh no, we got too many now. And I think, well, actually, the answer to that question is yes. There's always room for one more, provided that new business can find something that gives them that sustainable competitive advantage, whether it's their product, their pizza, or something else, or their location, or their pricing, or how they advertise, to get people in. They got to do something, and in that of that nature. And unless they can do it, and the word sustainable is very important. If you just come in with a competitive advantage, you make a certain kind of pizza that nobody else makes. Well, if it's successful, if people see that it's successful at your place, all of a sudden every other pizza place in town is making that kind of pizza. That's not sustainable. You've got to find something that you can hold on to. And that's easier in some kinds of businesses than it is in others. But you've got to find something in those four P's. So that would be my primary source of advice. If the question is not they have a business in mind and what should they do to develop it, that they're just looking for opportunities, then I would say analyze, if it's in Gainesville, analyze Gainesville in some of the ways we've been talking about it today. Where's Gainesville going? What seem to be the trends? What are the growing aspects of Gainesville business? And they can actually get help with that. The Small Business Administration has an organization called SCORE, which stands for Service Corps Retired Executives. And they have retired executives who volunteer to help either new or existing small businesses develop. So there are resources around. The entrepreneurship program at UF is another place they could look. And students in the entrepreneurship program get a chance to develop some of their ideas. And they even have, presentations where they're critiqued on their ideas. So there are lots of opportunities, particularly in Gainesville, for students to, or anyone for that matter, to develop a business idea.
And we touched on it a little bit earlier with Gainesville kind of growing and, possibly to the west or the north, but what do you see as the biggest challenges or difficulties for Gainesville's economy, let's say in the next 5, 10 years?
Well, one challenge is infrastructure, as it is in a lot of places. The traffic in Gainesville, uh, particularly on certain streets and at certain times of day, is very challenging. And so Gainesville is going to need to develop some plan, and I'm sure they have one, but some plan to deal with that problem, particularly in new areas that are developing. I'm told that Newberry Road in the morning, inbound, and in the afternoon, outbound, quite far out, is quite clogged with traffic. That's one thing they're going to have to do. Taxation, Alachua County generally is thought of as having higher taxes than some surrounding counties.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the reason for that, of course, is that a lot of land in Alachua County is not in the tax base, like UF and Santa Fe and, other organizations like that. So there are challenges like that, the tax situation, regulatory environment, How easy is it to start a business? Even if you've got a great idea, what regulatory issues do you face, a business license, and all those kinds of things. Um, how business friendly is the community?
Mhm.
How is it a good place to do business as opposed to somewhere else you might go? All those are factors that they'd have to take into account. But as Gainesville grows, it's going to have opportunities for certainly for developers, uh, real estate developers. It's got a lot of opportunities uh, as it grows, and the nature. One of the things my friend that went to UF with years ago, when he came back, he couldn't believe the high-rise buildings around UF because in Gainesville, when we were in school way back when, the only high-rise building in Gainesville was the Siegel building
Mm.
that's been around since, I don't know, the 1920s or whatever it was. Certainly around UF, there was nothing like that. And now the corner of 13th University looks like New York or
Yeah.
Chicago or someplace like that. Again, that's a change. Gainesville is going up in height in addition to moving out in area. Um, and the nature of the housing, particularly student housing and otherwise in Gainesville is changing. The neighborhoods are changing. Um, and, when I lived in Gainesville, I lived over there on 17th Street in what was then a high-rise building. It was 5 stories high, apartment, but it's still there, just a block off University on 17th.
Okay.
That's where I lived when I was a student in Gainesville in the 60s. And it was a brand new building then.
Mhm.
And you could walk to class and do all those kinds of things. Well, now, if I move to Gainesville as a student, I don't know whether I want to live in that area or whether I'd want to live in, out in Archer Road or some other area that is more student. I had some students who came to Gainesville to go to Santa Fe a few years ago and with aspirations of going on to UF. And they were from Tampa. And they came to Gainesville and they wanted to become part of the Gainesville scene. And so they rented an apartment out by Santa Fe.
Mhm.
And they discovered after they got here, that area is not really part of the Gainesville scene as they envisioned it. It's not the UF scene. So they were disappointed. And I think they went back to Tampa after a year. It just wasn't what they expected. So, things like that. Um, Lots of changes that people in Gainesville are going to have to adjust to. There's also an old Gainesville, I call it. People who have lived in Gainesville for generations.
Mhm.
And I have a connection to that through an ancestor of mine who was in Gainesville and who is buried in Gainesville. So I've had an opportunity to interact with some of those people, and that's a whole different world from the Gainesville that people know in terms of the university and the students and everything like that. It's like in Ocala, some people have said we have the horse people and everybody else. It's a different world,
Mhm.
even though geographically it's close together. And Gainesville has some of that too. So there are lots of opportunities, lots of ways that Gainesville and businesses and people can develop in Gainesville. But it's going to take some vision to see where Gainesville is going and try to be out in front of that rather than playing catch up.
I think that was all the questions I had. Was there any other topics that you wanted to discuss that we didn't get a chance to, or anything else you wanted to add?
Well, of course, another Gainesville business that has moved in recent years, but which was very successful, was the Swamp Restaurant.
Right.
And, you could analyze that and say, why were they successful? Well, obviously, the location was part of it,
Mhm.
but It became a kind of institution, as did Burrito Brothers and some of
Right.
those others.
And Leonardo's
And
too.
oh yeah, Leonardo's. And so how did they get there? Why are those businesses remembered as opposed to the ones that might have been here but faded away for some
Hmm.
reason?
Yeah, that's something that I've been looking into, and especially with Burrito Brothers because it was such a huge institution for 40 some years. And, it closed with the construction when they built those
Right.
the apartments on University and 13th there. And so, but it was a very interesting interview. He was saying that he still kind of has these, loyal customers from 30 years ago who reach out and, are ordering the, the red sauce or the seasoning from him or merchandise, and he still runs that sort of aspect of the business.
And he developed in that way. And I think the swamp, I believe, is in a new location
Hmm.
now, isn't it? Or is going to be?
Yeah, I think it opened two and a half years ago, I want to
Is
say.
that it? Okay. I've been
On
to the old swamp. I haven't been to the new one.
Yeah, I think it's just south of University and
Is it?
east of 13th. Yeah,
Okay.
I don't
West of
remember the
30.
name. Yeah, I don't remember the name of that the street that it's on, but yeah, I think two blocks south of University. Yeah,
Oh, okay. Okay.
yeah, and that's something that we're working on with the project that we're doing too. Is we're trying to make a database of all of the businesses in Gainesville going all the way back to the 1890s. So we've
Right.
really kind of we've been working with newspapers and city directories, phone books, those kind of resources to try to get the data.
And of course, another type of business in Gainesville, which has changed, and Florida generally, uh, from years ago, is the banking industry.
Hmm.
Because Florida, back the first time I was in Gainesville, was a so-called unit banking state. Every bank had to be separate. There were no branches.
Hmm.
So a bank in downtown Gainesville could not open a branch on University or on 34th Street. It would have to be a whole new bank, different name, so on.
Hmm.
Florida was behind the curve on that because a lot of North Carolina, for example, had statewide branch banking.
Hmm.
And that's why North Carolina banks grew to be so large relative to Florida banks. And eventually, when Florida legalized branch banking, the North Carolina banks and some others from out of state came in and bought the Florida banks.
Hmm.
So now in Florida, there are no large Florida based banks.
Right.
There are still some Florida banks, I mean, that are headquartered here, but the big ones are all located out of state. That did not used to be the case
Hmm.
in that industry.
That's interesting.
And then, and in retailing, Burdines was a big uh, name in retailing in Florida, department store for many years. It's gone. It's Macy's now, part of Macy's. But there are other businesses. If you look back in Florida business history, there are a lot of cases like that. There's a Florida home improvement chain that I think predated Lowe's and Home Depot.
Hmm.
It was called Scotty's. I believe it's based in Lakeland.
Okay.
It's gone now. And yet Scotty's was originally in Florida, but for whatever reason, it didn't survive.
Hmm.
Publix, on the other hand, which started in Florida, has become the dominant chain. And yet I can remember the time as a kid where on the East Coast, we didn't have Publix.
Hmm.
It was strictly a West Coast,
Hmm.
Tampa Bay kind of operation.
And now it's up in Atlanta and other
Oh, yeah,
areas too.
now. Well, for many years, another restriction that Publix put on itself was they didn't want to operate outside Florida.
Yeah.
And not only that, they didn't want to operate in the panhandle
Hmm.
because they believed that they needed to be close to their warehouses and deal with the market. So even Panama City, Pensacola, places like that did not have a Publix until long after the rest of the state did.
Hmm.
And there are regulatory reasons for that. For example, my friend's business in North Carolina, I've asked him, you know, why didn't you expand to Virginia or South Carolina? And he said, no, he said he'd rather stay in one state. And he's the largest home-owned business of its type in North Carolina. But he said, I'd rather stay in one state where I know the regulations, I know the politics, I know everything else that goes with it. And he's made that work. And Publix had that idea about Florida for many, many years. They didn't want to. And also another thing about Publix that you may not remember, but Publix stores used to close on Sunday.
Hmm.
You know, Chick-fil-A closes on Sunday now, but Publix stores closed on Sunday for many, many years.
Hmm.
And it was only when the competitive pressures got so great, because Sunday now is one of the big shopping days of the week for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
It was only when the competition got so that was open on Sunday, started getting so many customers that Publix finally opened on Sunday.
Hmm.
And then they decided, well, we've pretty much saturated Florida with Publix stores. So how are we going to grow? You know, there's some growth that would come from internal Florida, but they decided, hey, we need to go into other states. The problem they had when they did that was Publix in other states didn't have the mystique that Publix has in Florida. And it had a different set of competitors in many areas. For example, in Atlanta, Proctor is a big competitor. Kroger doesn't have stores in Florida,
Mm-hmm.
to my knowledge.
I don't
They
think
have
so.
a delivery service now, but
Mm-hmm.
they didn't have stores. So you got a different competitive mix. And if you ever been to a Publix store outside Florida, many of them are very different than Publix
Yeah.
stores in Florida because they need to be. They need that competitive advantage, which in Florida, to some degree now, they can get just because it's Publix,
Right.
you know, but outside Florida, they were an unknown
Mm-hmm.
and they had to develop that.
Yeah.
So, but it's a Florida company,
Yeah.
you know. And another thing about Publix is it's employee owned. You can't buy stock in Publix.
Hmm.
My father always said he wished he could, but you can't unless you're an employee. And that's another aspect of Publix. It's owned by its employees. And that makes a difference in terms of how a business is run. One thing that people say, what I've asked classes this, what do you think when you think about Publix? And one of the things that comes up frequently is people say, the stores are so clean. Well, the stores don't clean themselves. You know, somebody has to clean them and somebody has to take pride
Mm-hmm.
in having a clean store. Well, if you're an employee and you own stock in the company, you want the store to do well. You're much more likely to clean the store. You're much more likely to greet the customers. You're much more likely to do all those kinds of things. And public stock, by the way, for those employees, there's several employees who've been with Publix for a long time that are millionaires now based on their public stock. And I've had students at UF who were working at Publix while they were in school and who took advantage of the stock. And they said, it's great. I had one student that would come to me several times during the semester and say, my public stock went up again, and would tell me that. So, I mean, there are ways to do that. And, you know, Publix has become very successful as a result.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that the kind of the regional grocery supermarket, however you want to put it, it does build this kind of cult following.
Yes.
And in, Atlanta, they have, some Kroger, and North Carolina Harris Teeter as well.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
I think
Right.
that's another interesting thing too.
Harris Teeter, of course, now is owned by Kroger.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Huh.
But yes, it's a dominant chain in that area. Has been, and Publix, of course, now exists there too.
Mm-hmm.
But they've had to come in and establish themselves because when people thought about a somewhat upscale supermarket in North Carolina, they'd think about Harris Teeter. And so Publix had to come in and, establish themselves as that.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, so even in that, but again, as we said earlier, students at least don't seem to want to make a career out of the grocery industry. And yet it can be very rewarding financially and otherwise.
Hmm. Yeah. And another business I just thought of kind of the opposite way of Publix coming from, I don't know if it's actually a North Carolina-based business, but Bojangles in
Yes, it
Gainesville.
is. It is.
I think 2 years ago, maybe 2.5 years ago, the Bojangles on Archer Road closed.
Well, Bojangles has had some problems. And even though they've expanded, they still have one in Ocala.
Okay.
But I think they had some product quality issues.
Hmm.
Health inspections didn't go as well as might have. And that's my impression,
Okay.
that they may have had those. But yeah, it's definitely a North Carolina company.
Hmm.
Um, and I know up there it's a much more, well,
Yeah.
actually, another North Carolina-based company, historically, although it's owned out of state now, it was Food Lion,
Yep.
which has been very successful in North Carolina and other places, and completely flopped in Florida. And there again, that had to do with primarily with product quality issues. There was a TV expose about selling meat past the sell-by date, and things like that. So there are those kinds of, but it's still big in North Carolina.
Yeah.
Food Lion.
Hmm. And in
uh,
Virginia too, I know it's
and
pretty big.
Virginia.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are other. Of course, in the supermarket industry, the big news now is Aldi.
Yep.
Which is coming in and now owns Winn-Dixie
Hmm.
and is changing stores, including one in Gainesville, as I
Hmm.
understand it, from Winn-Dixie's to Aldi.
Yeah, I know the Winn-Dixie in Gainesville near kind of Depot Park in that area closed down, I want to say last year, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not sure what they've done with the space since I've left. Yeah.
Well, a lot of large retailers, the problem with that, like supermarkets, Kmart, some of those places, when they close down, it's very difficult to find a use for that
Hmm.
property because most businesses don't need that much space.
Right.
And some places they have subdivided it and done some things with it. But it's difficult. Also, by the way, in Gainesville, the Target in Butler Plaza
Mhm.
has done well, as far as I know. Yet Target opened a store there on 13th Street,
Right.
right near the campus, and it's gone now. Didn't have the selection of the one, and that may be one reason. It
Right.
didn't have the selection of the Butler Plaza store. I'm told, although I have no independent verification of this, that the store on 13th Street had a larger theft problem
Hmm. Right.
than the one at Butler Plaza. I don't know, but it's gone.
Yeah.
And yet, you would think that a Target store in that location would do quite well.
Hmm.
So
And
I
they
don't
had
know
late
what that
hours
was.
also for students too.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I used to walk over there. When I was at UF, I'd walk over there and get some things and save me a trip to other Targets.
Right.
And yet it didn't work.
Yeah.
And so I'm not sure why, but it just shows that, the mix of variables in a certain situation can make it very successful in one place and basically a failure in another.
Yeah, I've heard that area has been one of those kind of, like we mentioned earlier, those haunted kind of locations even before they had the high rises there, that it
Oh,
was kind of
yeah.
this.
Yeah, that's true. There were
Mhm.
a lot of businesses that cycled through there.
Yeah.
Um, and of course, on the corner there, the northwest corner, there used to be a bicycle shop.
Hmm.
And a Starbucks and Maui Teriyaki and, places like that. But the bicycle shop was very prominent there. Uh, but now, of course, that's all gone.
Right.
And um, and I'm told UF, and maybe they started on this, I don't know, but apparently UF owns the southeast corner of that intersection,
Okay.
which of course had a gas station until
Right.
relatively recently. And I'm told, again, I don't, I have no independent verification, but I'm told that UF is going to erect a parking garage
Hmm.
on that property. Um, well, we'll see. It
Yeah.
certainly needs parking. So any additional parking is welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. No, I really appreciate you taking the time today and yeah, really enjoyed talking with you and
Well, I've enjoyed it, and I appreciate your doing this.
yeah, appreciate you. Have a great weekend. Talk
You
to
do
you
too.
soon. Be in touch.
Right. Good.
Bye.
Bye.